So, okay. So, we've just done the angels. They went back to heaven. Yeah. So, what's going on there? Oh, is it moving? Have I gone too far now? That's fine. Okay. So Mary treasured up these words, and she pondered in her heart what they might mean. I always like that verse. It's funny how certain verses capture you, and that one always has for some reason. Because there's a sense in which we're reading these things in Luke, and there are things in Luke that really Mary is the only real witness to. You know, I said last week how there's the evidence that Luke knows James, but James wasn't a witness of these things, but his mother was. And so the fact that Luke knows them means that Mary knew them, if we can put it that way. And so the fact that it says she remembers them, she pondered over them, she thought about them. If she had not pondered over them and thought about them, we would not have such a good description in Luke's gospel. You know, because people would forget it, wouldn't they? They kind of, I can't really remember now. But actually, it's the process of saying, I need to rethink this. So what happened on that night is amazing, wasn't it? What did it mean? She's gone through that process. And as a result, we have this wonderful description in the Gospel of Luke. And so the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen. And everything was just as they had been told. So I got there. It's an oblique acknowledgement of source. Mary's maintained the memory of the incidents, probably telling and retelling them to her family. So Jesus would be aware of these things. I'm convinced of that. Every mother tells their kids stories that happened during their birth and whatever, isn't it? And actually that's part of these events, therefore, are part of the shaping of Jesus and his theological understanding. If we take seriously what it says when it says he lays aside his divinity, he lays aside not claiming to be equal with God, but fully takes on our humanity, then just like all of our kids they learn as they go to school and they get taught how to read the Bible. We don't nowadays, but Jesus was. And he might read some things. And so, for instance, in the events that we've just gone through, Mary knows that when John the Baptist was born, Zechariah prophesied a horn of salvation in the house of David. If you remember that. Now, she's not there at that moment. But how do we know that story if it wasn't through Mary? And when Zacharias quotes that, he then I can't remember what the next phrase is. Sorry, I can do this quick. The next thing is a quote from Psalm 106. The next line. Should I do this? Sorry, I always think we're not going to have enough, and then we always end up with plenty to go through. So where is it? Where is it? He's raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of David. He spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets, salvation from our enemies, from the hand of all who hate us. And that's a quote, I think that one there, 71. Let's have a quick look. From Psalm 106. Yeah, 106 verse 10. So if I quickly go to 106 verse 10, it's just interesting. See, this is in my head because I've been doing the text for Jesus in worship, doing the Psalms. So I've just done this recently, so that's why it's in my head. So I'll just kind of share it with you. It's like an advert for the book. You should go out and buy one. So Psalm 106, which he quotes from after saying the horn of salvation. Where is it? I'm in Psalms, but I can't find the number 106 for some reason. Verse, yeah. That's him. Where is it? Go there. They believe his word, same praise. Where's it on? No, I can't find it now. There's a verse in the Psalm 106, though, sorry, where it says, visit us with your salvation. So that's the phrase, which I can't find now in the middle of Psalm 106. And it's ironic because Mary has been visiting his house for the last 6 months. So he quotes from a psalm that actually has in it, because the word salvation is Jesus' name. It actually has the name Jesus. So actually, there's a request in there. There's a prayer in Psalm 106, which is to please visit us with your Jesus. And for the last 3 months, staying in his house has been the pregnant Mary with a boy whose name she knows, and his name is Jesus. And I sometimes wonder to myself, I wonder if he thought of quoting from Psalm 106 because he read it because of the fact that that he's actually had Jesus visiting them, and thought, visiting salvation, that's a bit like that psalm as a priest. And so somehow it comes into that prophecy, if you see what I mean. So you get what I'm trying. Anyway, all these things pondered by Mary, and therefore they would have shaped Jesus, a bit like I'm describing there. If the horn of salvation, well, he'd have probably gone to have a look at that. Where does it talk about the horn of salvation? It talks about it. It talks about crying out to the temple and God answering. And so when he is crucified, Jesus cries out, and then it goes black, and then it says, and he answers, and it says he bows the heavens, and it came down in the great darkness. He would have read those words because they've been told to him. Does that make sense? Because Mary's kind of said, this is what happened. This was the word. That phrase, horn of salvation, is unique to that one psalm, and that one psalm talks about the person crying out and God answering with darkness, and actually on the cross that actually happens to Jesus. But anyway, that's totally not what we're looking at tonight. So at the end of the 8 days, when he was circumcised, he was named Jesus and given the name by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the time came for their purification, according to the law of Moses, so it's 40 days I think after the birth, Joseph and Mary brought Jesus up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, just as it's written in the law of the Lord. Every firstborn male will be set apart for the Lord. So rather obviously, Luke is kind of getting across to us that Jesus is set apart. It was always the plan. He's the firstborn. And to offer a sacrifice according to what's specified in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves and 2 young pigeons. And it's useful to notice that because it basically tells us that right now they're not wealthy. Because what's specified is that's an offering for people who can't afford a lamb. So they are in a situation where things are not easy, if I can put it that way. So Jesus is not born into an easy circumstance. I think I've touched on this before, but Joseph, as we read him as a carpenter, the word is tekton, and he's actually much more involved in building craftsmanship rather. So it's not that Joseph owns a little shop, if I can put it, because actually that requires wealth. It is much more like he is the jobbing builder who knocks on your door, says, do you have work that can be done? Does that make sense? And in that context, so he's got his young wife. He's a righteous man, though. He's a good righteous man. And she suddenly, even before they've come together, she's now pregnant, and there's embarrassment, and that may even impact them financially. And they've now had to make an expensive trip to protect her and stay for a period. And so money is kind of a tight situation at this point. And we have that reflected in the fact that they don't offer a lamb, they offer a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons, which is for those who can't afford it. So it just it gives you that little insight into Jesus' social situation. In a few years' time, in about 2 to 3 years' time, building work in Nazareth is going to explode. Which is a wonderful piece of provision of the Lord. I think I've touched on this before. But Sepphoris, which is 3.5 miles north of Nazareth, became, in 3 BC, the work seems to start in 3 BC, became the beginning of the building of a new capital for Galilee. So anyone who did the kind of work that Joseph did, and therefore Jesus was trained in, suddenly had work all the time. So that's a nice provision. It doesn't mean they're super wealthy, but it does mean they've got constant work. But as they get to the temple, now there's a man in Jerusalem named Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was looking for the restoration of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. And it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he wouldn't die before he'd seen the Lord's Christ. And there's a lovely little kind of touch there. Somehow or other, this man has the Holy Spirit. He's picked up from it that he's not going to die until he sees the Christ. His name's Simeon, which is the same as Simon. It's just this slight variation on the same name, which means someone who listens. It means the hearer, the listener. So you can imagine he's been there. He's been, there's a phenomena. What do they call it? Nominative determinism. So if you name a child a name that has some sort of meaning, they are more likely to do stuff in life that is like that. So so I'm just trying. So I think in one of my in my supernatural life books, Supernatural Hope it is, I have a little chapter on why God uses names. I actually traced down some real people with some hilarious names. There is a Dr. Oiseau who wrote an article who researches birds. I mean, his name is French for bird, and that's his job. And Mr. Fromage, who used to be the head of Danone, it was a Mr. or Monsieur Fromage. He was. And these aren't made up; these are genuinely true. And statistically, and every now and again, someone does a paper on it because they're trying to work out why. Statistically, if you give a child a name, they actually kind of do behave in the way that the name takes them, if that makes sense. So there are I'm just trying to think, there are loads of dentists called something. I'm just trying to remember what it was, but it's
film cavity.
Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah, that would be a bit too obvious, but anyway, so I just think there is something nice in the fact that this guy's grown up with the name The Listener. And what we pick up is that actually in his devotion he has heard something. You will see the Christ before you die, even though he's old, and he's holding on for this. So he's directed by the Spirit. He came into the temple court. So even at that moment, it's kind of, actually, I need to go in. I need to go and have a look. I need to go in today. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what was customary according to the law, I got it on the next page, Simeon took him in his arms and blessed God, saying, which is a lovely moment, isn't it? And he says this, now according to your word, Lord, permit your servant to depart in peace, so I can go now. You told me I'd see him, and I have. My eyes have seen your salvation, which is, of course, Jesus' name. Don't know whether he was speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, but both ways it comes out pretty much the same. Salvation, Isa or Yeshua. That you have prepared in the presence of all your peoples. And then he says, a light of revelation to the Gentiles. And I've got a whole list of quotes there. That Isaiah 9:2, do you remember? That is the special child, God with us. He's going to be a light to the Gentiles. He draws in here, and comes up again in 42 with the suffering servant. The suffering servant is introduced. It says he'll be a light to the Gentiles. So this idea of the one that's coming, whether it's the special child or it's the suffering servant in Isaiah, he regularly uses that phrase. And for the glory of your people. The bit that I really like is he talks about Galilee of the Gentiles in Isaiah 9. So actually it's the end of Isaiah 8, beginning of Isaiah 9. So it's you Zebulun and Naphtali, though you're least amongst the tribe of Judah. And in later times, I can't find all the words. It's one of the frustrating things of having had the strokes a few years ago, is I can't always pull all the words like I used to be able to. But it makes that it says a new Galilee by way of the sea. I always love that in Isaiah, because when Isaiah spoke it, it was just a phrase, by way of the sea. But the Romans built a road that ran all the way down. It followed the Mediterranean down to Egypt, and as it came up, it just cut in to Galilee and then back out again. And Jesus, of course, is going to flee from Galilee to Egypt, and he's going to come back to Galilee on the road, which the Romans called the Via Maris, which means the way of the sea. But they hadn't built until hundreds of years after Isaiah threw the prophecy in. So all of this little thing, but so again, these are words that I think shape Jesus. Jesus focuses all of the early part of his ministry in Galilee, and actually you can draw that from the idea of the light to the Gentiles, because Galilee was the first area to be kind of lost in Israel's history because it was right at the far extreme. And so even in Isaiah's day, it was called Galilee of the Gentiles because there were so many Gentiles who lived there, if you like. And so by giving him that little phrase, a light of revelation for the Gentiles, it probably kind of, Jesus, as he's meditating, well, there are things that I need to do in Jerusalem, but actually an awful lot of my ministry is a bit on the edge. And it's a bit like if you were thinking of, I'm going to, if we could, I'm going to plan a big evangelistic campaign. Nobody would think of doing it in Cardiff, would we? We would do it in London. Cardiff is too big probably to say. Let's think of a smaller town somewhere. You wouldn't say, let's do it in Swindon. We're going to change the nation. Let's do it in Swindon. You get? Jerusalem is the place. Jericho is an important place. Galilee, what are their places? The important towns in Galilee are names we hardly know. Tiberias and Sepphoris, they're the big towns. They're not Jewish towns. They're actually Greek towns. They're Roman towns. Does that make sense? So the only big towns in Galilee. So why would you do a mission? Why would you do it in Galilee of the Gentiles? And I think some of it is just tied up. And what's so lovely is the way in which obviously there's prophecy from the Old Testament that Jesus' life models. But actually, even in the flow of the moment, as they take him into the temple, somebody kind of comes over and speaks a prophetic word, and Mary will remember it, and she'll tell Jesus, and therefore it becomes part of his shaping and his thinking, and probably part of the gospel as we know it is being kind of put together. That's part of the way the Father has communicated with his Son, but as a human being, that Jesus is still human. There are a couple of occasions where he has angelic visitations and Moses and Elijah come, but that's not every day. Most of the time he's picking it up in his spirit by prayer because he is human. So what have I got there? Issue has gone forth. I can't remember why I put that there. So you can have a look, see if you can work out for yourself. Oh, here it is. Yeah, attend to me, my people, and give ear to me, my nation. For a law shall go forth from me, and I will establish my justice and a light of the Gentiles. My righteousness is near. My salvation, which is Isha, is gone forth. My arm shall judge the peoples. The islands shall wait for me and on my arm they shall trust. But just to give you kind of the examples of all of the ideas tied up in his prophecy. And after, of course, Simeon has prophesied, another lady comes over. He gives a warning as well to Mary. Yes, that's true. So he genuinely does feel like a real prophetic person, doesn't he? And I bet he never thought that there would be people sitting in a country that he's never even heard of on a dark night 2,000 years later talking about Simeon, who obviously listened.
Gentiles.
Yeah, Gentiles as well, even Gentiles, yeah. So the child's father and mother are amazed at what they said, and then Simeon blessed them and then says to his mother Mary, so listen carefully, this child is destined to be a cause of falling and rising in many Israel, and to be a sign that will be rejected. Indeed, as a result of him, the thoughts of the many will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul as well. And as I say, I hesitate to say wonderfully prophetic, because obviously it's tragically prophetic, but it's that actually Mary does have to watch her son being pierced, and it must have cut her. And there's a kind of a wonderful sense of, if you like, of the grace of the Lord that prepares people. If you ever notice that people who go through suffering often don't lose their faith as much as people who watch people going through suffering. Have you ever noticed that? Because it often seems to be that there's something of the grace of the Lord that prepares us for what we go through and meets us in the context of that. Whereas if you're watching from the outside, you're just left with the academic choice of, do I get angry with God, or do I try and understand something that is not mine to understand? And I can't understand the fact that actually in your heart, strangely, there is a peace that surpasses understanding. That phrase that we throw out, peace that surpasses understanding. I think the word surpasses is wrong there. Peace that doesn't make sense is perhaps a better is what that is perhaps driving at. And part of the way he does it, sometimes he does prepare people for knowing it isn't going to be easy.
Peace that goes beyond understanding.
Beyond understanding, yeah. Or peace that is beyond it, beyond what I can really think. But there's also a prophetess Anna. I've just kind of highlighted. Anna means grace or favour. Grace. She's the daughter of someone called Phanuel, which means the face of God, of the tribe of Asher, which means happy. Which I just thought it's kind of, that feels really nice. must have been really nice knowing that you're grace, grace, and your dad was the face of God to you, and your tribe is happy. The nice thing. She's very old, having been married now. she was married to her husband for 7 years until his death. Now she lives as a widow for 84. So she's lived for 91 years since she got married. So she probably got married, if we take it, about 14. So she's 100 and, what is that? 105 years old. And she comes over. And at that moment she came up and began to give thanks for God and speak about the child who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. So the kind of things we've seen as tonight, it starts with the shepherds, but remember that phrase that was there in the rabbinic writings from Jonathan, that the beginning of the revelation of the Messiah would happen from the Tower of the Flock, and the angels have turned up there, and the shepherds have gone back, found the baby, and gone out and started telling people. So it started from there, but now it's moving into Jerusalem, and here are two people, both very old, but with a kind of a devout, sincere relationship that's reached out for the Lord and has heard something back, and they start to witness and testify. So when Joseph and Mary had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, now here's an interesting thought. They returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. I put there, note the missing story of the Magi and the trip to Egypt. Because the timing here seems to be that, well, they've had to have done the 40 days, and there's probably a few other bits, but it doesn't seem like a long gap. And we'll look at it properly next week when we look at the Magi. I'm just going to flag it here. The Magi are directed to Bethlehem to look for the child, but Bethlehem is 2 hours from Herod's palace, and they've got camels, and it talks about them seeing the star going ahead of them. Okay, that doesn't happen in a 2-hour journey in the middle of the day. Can I put it that way? And actually what we're told here in Luke is that they've gone back to Galilee. All we're ever told in Matthew's account is that they are directed to go and start looking in Bethlehem. And eventually the star goes ahead of them and stands over where the child was. And I'm just kind of messing a little bit with our assumptions, because the best way, it's not the only way, the best way of understanding the flow of events is actually, and you say, well, but surely Herod, he killed the babies in Bethlehem. Well, that's because that's the only place he knew. Remember, they've come to him. He said, go and look in Bethlehem. They've gone down there, and then they've somehow got away without him realizing they've left Jerusalem. But we'll do it properly next time. But what I'm going to drive at is actually probably the Magi experience is not happening in Bethlehem. It's just that's where they went to start their search. And it takes them a little bit of time to find Jesus. If it hadn't been that it would take a bit of time, then they could have come back to they could have sent a message back to Herod that afternoon to say we found him. So you see the kind of story. So it seems that actually at this point, Mary and Joseph decide to head back to where the family are, and presumably they've been away long enough that they feel like that as they turn up again, it will take people a bit of time to kind of click on the timings and so on and so forth. And we're going to see the Magi come a little bit later next week. So does anyone want to ask any questions? I think that's the last. Yeah, it is the last slide.
I have a question, but it may be something that you're going to cover down, and if it is, don't answer it. I can wait.
Okay.
Okay. But the question, it was just about Jesus' childhood,
Mm-hmm.
and it talks about. You can't help but wonder what he was as a child.
Mm-hmm.
But is it okay to assume that he probably wasn't a perfect little boy, because the scripture says, and I'm not saying that he was a bad boy.
No, I know what you're saying.
Okay.
I get what you're saying.
Because the scripture says he'll eat this and that until he knows
Right. Yeah.
right from wrong.
Yeah.
So would that imply that he was just a normal child?
That's such a fantastic question, Sharon. And the last week that we do here, we're doing Jesus' childhood in Egypt and then back.
So you want to wait.
So
Okay.
but actually, now because you've asked the question, I will deliberately look to kind of answer some things a little bit on that. So yeah, we'll put it into the mix because I think it's a really good question to give the kind of like the the morality and understanding and everything, they kind of go together, if you see what I mean. In other words, I'm not held guilty if I do something that I don't know is leading to somebody else's death. Does that make sense? I'm held guilty if I do know. So if you like, knowledge is tied up to the issue of morality, kind of the drive of it. And actually, therefore, what is it? What do we understand? Jesus is perfect within his context, but actually, sometimes what we think of as perfection is sometimes something we've imposed on it. So if I give, for example, does Jesus? The question is, does Jesus ever get a cold? Because we have an arbitrary thing of I feel sick or actually just my body is dealing with the fact that I live in an unclean world and I'm dealing with stuff, and where we draw the line is a little bit arbitrary. If I eat 50 donuts a day for my diet, I will get pains in my heart. Now, sorry, what's the is that a sickness, or is it me abusing my own body? Does that make sense? In other words, if I turn up to the doctor and say I'm sick, actually we use the same word, but actually it's just no, your body is not coping with the way you're using it, if I can put it that way. And so a lot of those kind of questions come into the answer, which is that Jesus is leading a fully human life, but he is always victorious in it. That's the so I have this question. I don't have a concrete answer, but if Jesus never got a cold because they weren't allowed to touch him, then he never actually beat a cold. Does that make sense? But actually, to have victory over a cold is those little microbes got into me, and I get a runny nose, and it's really itchy and whatever, and I'm whatever. But actually, my body kicks it out, and I've dealt with it. What's the failure? So it's one of those interesting kind of questions, but I think it's a really good one to ask, because in particular, there's the issue of we sing "Little Lord Jesus, no crying He makes," so we want in a full reverence, we want to put something on Jesus which I think is unnatural, if I can put it that way, but it's difficult to talk about because it can sound like you're diminishing.
Well, and along with that, the thing that makes me wonder is that his brothers didn't exactly look at him as perfect. So there had to be, not that that Jesus sinned or did anything wrong, but there was something there that...
And I think the reality would be, when we get there, Sharon, is we can't come up with a definitive. It's a bit like I was saying earlier, because actually some things are only knowable in the moment, and we're now looking from the outside. But what I like about the discussion is I think there are times when it's important to emphasize the divinity of Jesus. In other words, the effect of the cross, I think is kind of hinged on the divinity of Jesus. The incredible nature of the cross is based on Jesus' humanity.
Would it be? I don't want to monopolize or anything like that. Because I have lots of questions. I don't want to do that. And people probably want to go home. But the question I have about the cross is the cross when he's on there. Is that when his divinity as God really comes into play, in the sense that what he went through would have killed a person, I would think, under normal circumstances. But he had made the statement back that I lay down my life and I take it up and no man can take it from me.
And the reality is I go through different seasons on the answer to that. I think that there is a victory in the cross that belongs to Jesus' humanity. But there is an effect of the cross, which I think that's what I was driving at, that belongs to his divinity. So the victory is that as a human, with all his human limitations, he goes through what he goes through in the cross, including the consequences of the world's sin, which he's never participated in a way that's worthy of death. He goes through that, and he doesn't, like Job is tempted, why don't you curse God and die? But he never does. Even when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a question, not an accusation. And actually, the last thing he ever says from the cross is, into your hands I commit my spirit. If you read the psalm that's a quote from, because remember I said I've just been writing them up, so if you read the Psalms, which is Psalm 31, you read through, it actually says, I cried out in my distress, and you heard it as a prayer. I love that. I really do. In other words, I cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But the Lord heard it, not as an accusation, but as a prayer. Does that make sense? So but all of that, I think, is going on, if you like, in Jesus with all his. The reason is he has that question is because he is limited. He doesn't know everything about the universe. He's not got omniscience. He is limited to having a human brain. He's doing this by faith. By faith, he believes that the Lord won't leave him in the grave, and the passages seem to be that it's the Lord redeems him and resurrects him, and I think that belongs to Jesus' humanity. But the breaking, if you like, of the power of sin is probably because of the devil's kind of overstepping of a mark. A bit like if you're okay. Just trying to give a good example. You get into a legal battle with someone, and then someone oversteps. So I've got a good example. Okay, so now we're recording this. It's happened to my parents. They had an argument with the taxman a few years back, not because they're super wealthy, but because way back my father had gone to see the taxman because of the way he did ministry. So he would go to a church, he would do ministry, he'd go with someone who'd drive them. And they would give him a gift. It would have a check with his name on it. And he would gift some of that to the person he took because he was deliberately training them. So he went and talked to his taxman way back then and said, this is what happens. It's going through my account, but it's not really my income. But it's going through personal accounts. And he got a letter to say this. But anyway, he had a taxman that basically came and said, no, it's always been illegal. It doesn't matter that you had the letter. It doesn't matter that was agreed. You owe 30 something plus years of tax. Everything you did there, you now have to pay tax on. And he said, well, that's unjust. And actually the taxman said to him, that doesn't matter. So that's irrelevant. It's not just. It's still the law, and you're going to do it. But then the guy lets slip in a correspondence that he was fed up with the fact that Christian ministries tried to do these things, and he was involved with some other situations. And the lawyer that was acting for my parents spotted that what he'd done was he'd stated something illegal. He'd given away something that was, and his whole case against my parents collapsed on his overstepping his jurisdiction, if I can put it that way. So there is a sense in which there is something about the devil trying to do something to Jesus in his divinity that somehow by overstepping what he's really able to do, he loses his ability to do anything, if you like. He's overstepped the mark, and I think that some of that belongs more to Jesus' divinity. But if you like, the thing that's so incredible about the cross is that in his humanity, Jesus could go through what he goes through, and still finish with, and into your hands I commit my spirit, which is this wonderful statement of faith, really. It's in your hands. I can't do anything else. So. Anyway, we'll do that when we get there, Sharon. But thanks ever so much for everyone coming and giving me the opportunity. And if I've got your emails now, I will send you the links to these, so you can, if you're a real glutton for punishment, you can rewatch them after Christmas dinner. Forget the Queen's speech. You can watch these.
I know my place.
Yeah.